So let's make sure that our product items on the product overview screen look a bit nicer than they're currently looking. Right now, of course, every product item is just rendered as a text component, and that's not really what I want here. Instead, I'll remove that import and I'll create a brand new component that should be responsible for my product item. Now, one important note regarding where we create that component. We can create it here in the products overview.js file as well. We can, of course, have more than one component per file. So here I could add my product item component, or however you want to call it, like this. Then we can use this component in this file, which is, of course, what I plan to do. This is a pattern you can use if you have a component that's really strongly tied to another component and you're only splitting it so that each component is a bit more readable. Once these separate components get very big, you should still consider splitting them into separate files though, so that your files stay small. And if people want to have a look at one of the two components, they don't have to scroll over the other component they might not be interested in. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Of course, if you also plan on using a component in yet another component, you should always store it in a separate file, not only so that you can export it as a default, because you could also export this if it's stored along with another component. That's not the main reason. But mostly to make it really clear that this is a standalone component that might and will be used in different parts of your app. Now, the product item here will not only be not super small, which on its own would be a reason to put it into a separate file, but I will also use it in a different component later, or in different places of the app. It's not just relevant to the products overview screen. And therefore, I'll add it in the components folder, and in that components folder, to kind of organize my components a little bit, I'll add a shop subfolder where I want to place all the components that are directly related to the shop feature or to features in general of my app. So in there, in the shop subfolder, I'll add this product item.js file. And you'll see which other folders I will add here later. Now again, all these patterns and practices I'm showing you here are just possible ways of doing this. In general, in my courses, and in this course too, I show all the best practices you can use, but often in programming, there is not just a single right or a wrong way. So the practices and patterns I'm showing here are practices and patterns you'll see in other projects too. But you might also see other folder structures. In the end, you can always work with the structure that works for you. There isn't a right or wrong choice here. I just want to explain my reasoning for using this structure, which hopefully helps you understand why I use it and why this might be worth a thought. So here, the product item file, the product item.js file, of course, will hold the product item component, which is a normal functional component that receives props and in the end will return JSX code. And therefore, since it holds JSX code, we need to import React from React. And in here, I'll also import things from React Native, because here I'll now work with these React Native primitives to really build my component. Because from there, I'll need the view, I'll need the text. I also want to use the image because we'll display the product image here, and also the style sheet because we'll definitely also style this. Hence, we can also already add a styles constant here, which we create with style sheet create, to which we pass a JavaScript object. And in the end, we export this product item here as a default, of course. Now in here, in this component, we can start creating the JSX code that makes up product item. And this will be a presentational component, which means there won't be any logic in here. We won't manage any internal state. This will just be a component we can use in other components to get the right styling and layout out of the box. So this component here will be responsible for using certain React Native components and laying them out and styling them in a certain way. So in here, I in the end want to return a view which wraps everything, which organizes everything, which we can also style to get this card look with maybe a drop shadow, maybe rounded corners, whatever you want. And in there, we now have different parts. For example, we'll definitely have the image in there, the product image. I also want to have the title and the price, so we'll need some text in here. So for the title here, and here then for the price in dollars. And below that, I also want to have a view with buttons. So here we can use the built-in button component for the moment, where we can then add a product to the cart or also view the details. So where we have these two options basically. And of course, we'll need to add on press handlers here. So that's the very basic skeleton, probably not the final one. We'll have to see how we can style everything here. But that's the layout I want. I wrap my buttons here into a view, by the way, because I want to have them side by side in a row. And by having a view around them, we can style that view such that it uses flex direction row and so on. So that's the setup we can work with here. Now let's add some styling. And for that, I want to use, we're going to start here on the surrounding view, where I set up styles product like this. Therefore, here in the style sheet, I add product like that. Add my product key here. And of course, now again, it's totally up to you how you want to style this. I want to have that card look. So therefore, I'll add a shadow color, which can be black, a shadow opacity, which can be 0.26, a shadow offset, where I have the width offset of 0 and a height offset of 2, and a shadow radius of 8 maybe. And as always, play around with these values to find your configuration. Now you might remember that shadow only works on iOS, so for Android I'll add the elevation property here and set this to 5 maybe. Again, you can experiment with different values there as well. And I want to have a border radius of 10 because I want rounded corners. And again, that's something I want here, something you don't have to do. I'll also add the background color of white to make sure that our card here, our product, always has this background color, even if our main app should use a different background color later. So that's my product, my wrapper here around the entire product. I additionally also want to set up my height here. Every product should have a height of 300 pixels. And of course, that is a value you can also tweak to your requirements. You could, of course, also make this dynamic with the Dimensions API, as you learned it in the responsive module. And I'll add a margin of 20 in all directions around every product item so that we have a spacing in all directions. With this setup, we can start working on outputting something. So the image needs a source, and we'll get a network image here because if you have a look at the dummy data, all these image URLs here are, well, URLs. That's also what we have in the model. We expect a URL here, so to a network image. And that would be the default, of course, for any shop you build, because you'll never include all the product images into your app, at least if it's not some in-app shop for a game. But if it's a shop where people can create products, obviously people will create products dynamically after your app was distributed. So it's impossible for you to include all images into your app. Instead, they have to be stored on a server. So therefore, here we need to pass an object to source where we set the URI property. And that will now be received from outside because this product item component is presentational. So any data to display needs to be passed in through props. And there we could expect the image prop, but as for all the props in your own components, you can pick any names you want. For the title, I expect to get a title prop, and for the price, I expect to get a price prop. I'll keep the dollar sign here, by the way, because price will just be a number, and of course I want to have a dollar sign in front of this. Now, one little note here, I want to make sure that the price I get always has exactly 2 decimal places, and we can achieve this by calling toFixed on this and passing in a 2. toFixed is a function available on numbers in JavaScript, which converts this to basically a string with a fixed amount of decimal places. And here I restrict this to always be 2 decimal places. That's normal JavaScript, nothing specific to React Native. Now, when we press the View Details button, then I will trigger props on View Detail. So I, again, use a name here, which you can configure or name however you want. But the idea here is that props on View Detail points at a function which in the end is executed when this button is pressed. And therefore here, if this button, the card button, is pressed, I'll point on to a function which I expect to get on the onAdd to card prop. Again, you can name these props whatever you want, but when you use your component, you have to make sure they are available and that they get values which are functions, which then are triggered through these buttons. Now we're getting all the data. Now for the image, since this is a network image, we need to set up the width and height because the image can't see that in advance, as it could do it for a local image. It can't do this for a network image. So here I'll point at styles.image and I'll add this image key to my style sheet therefore. Now again, it's generally up to you how you style this, but I'll set this to have a width of, let's say, 60%. Keep in mind that the overall product has a height of, a width of 100%, but a height of 60% because the overall product item here has a height of 300. And I want to have the image in there. That should also take up the majority of the height, but I also have the title and the price and my buttons, and these should also fit in there. So I'll give the image 60% of the height so that the other things here can split the remaining 40% amongst them. So with that, that's the image. Now, of course, the image isn't everything we have here. We also do have, well, our title, we do have our price, and I want to style that as well. So for the title, I'll add the title style here. And for the price, I'll add, let's say, a price style. And here, for these buttons, I'll also add a style to the surrounding view, and I'll name this actions. And of course, all these style names, as always, are totally up to you. Here, I want to add my title and, well, the price and the actions property to my style sheet here. And now for the title, you can of course style this in whatever way you want. We have no custom fonts here. I will add some soon, but for the moment I'll, well, just ignore that and just start with a font size of 18. And I want to add a margin vertical, so top and bottom, of 3, or 4. So very small margin, but still some margin around this title. For the price, I'll set a font size of 14, so a bit smaller, and I'll also give this a color, which should be maybe 888, which is like a grayish, dark grayish color. Now, actions is placed on that view, which holds the buttons, and therefore I want to make sure that the buttons sit next to each other, so in one row. So I'll give this a flex direction of row here, and I will also justify the content to have all the remaining space between them. And in addition, I want to align items in the center vertically, so along the cross axis, which for a flex direction of row is the vertical axis. With that, we have some basic styling. Now let's use that component before we refine the setup and the styling. So the product item component, which we do export here in the product item file, can now be used in the products overview file by importing product item from there. So let's point at our components folder, there at the shop subfolder, and then at product item. And now this is what I want to use here when I render my items. Product item can be a self-closing component because all the data is received through props and not between the opening and closing tags. Now, of course, we need to set up all the things we expect here. We expect the image, the title, the price, and our 2 event handling props here. So that's what we need to provide now. Hence, here on product item, I'll start with the image, and that, of course, is item data.item.image URL, and you always must remember that item data.item points as a product as defined in our product model, and therefore it will have an image URL property written like this. If you wrote it differently, you of course need to access it differently. Besides the image, we'll also have a title, which is item data.item.title. And besides that, we'll have the price with item data item.price. And then we have our 2 event handlers here, because we do have the onViewDetail prop and the onAddToCart prop we need to add. So onViewDetail will do something later. For now, it's just an empty function. And onAddToCart will also do something later. For now, it can also be an empty function. This is how a product item should be rendered. With that, if we save this, this is what you should see. It's not perfect yet, but we're getting there. This is not too bad, actually. Now, of course, what you notice is that the buttons are colored in the wrong way, that this space isn't really used in the way it should be used down there, that we maybe also want to center this text, but these are, of course, things we can work on. So to refine this, back in the product item component here, let's start with our two texts here. They should, of course, be centered. That can be done in a very simple way by wrapping that with a view, moving these two texts in there, giving that view a style, and of course you can name this however you want. I'll name it details, because we kind of lay out the product details there. So I will add my details style here to the style sheet, and there I'll just set align items center. This uses a flex direction of column, the default, and therefore centers on the cross axis. It always does this, but the cross axis for flex direction column is of course left to right, so it centers horizontally, which is what I want here. And I'll also give this a height of 15%. Keep in mind that the image takes 60%, so we give this maybe 15%, so almost half of the remaining 40%, not quite half. And I'll add a little bit of padding here, of 10 maybe. And for the buttons here, these are in my actions property. There, I want to set the height to the remaining 25%. Whoops, that should be a string, of course. Because we have 60% here height, then we have 15% here, hence here I want to have the remaining 25%. And if we now save this, this looks way better. Now some padding to the left and the right would also be nice for the buttons, so on this actions style property I'll add a padding horizontal of 20 maybe, so that we have some internal spacing left and right. Now to change the color of the buttons, we can just go to the button components, which are built into React Native, and set the color prop here to colors, which you therefore need to import from the constants folder and from the colors file there, and set this then to colors primary, also here for the second color, the add to cart button, add a second button therefore. So now we have our buttons here, add to cart and view details, and this doesn't look too bad. The one remaining thing which you might notice is that we don't have rounded corners here at the top, and the reason for that is that our image basically is like an overlay to our background, and the background is the surrounding view. The image has no rounded corners, and therefore it overlaps our rounded corners we have on the surrounding view. To fix that, we can wrap the image into a separate view. And as I mentioned earlier in the course, it's really normal in React Native to have a couple of nested views, because to this view we can now attach a style, which we can maybe give an image container identifier, which we can now add to our style sheet. And now I'll give this image container my width and height here. And on the image, I'll therefore just add a width and height of 100% because it's now inside of the container. This here refers to the parent, so to this container. So a height of 60% will then also be applied to the image. But on that image container, we can now add a border top left radius of 10 and a border top right radius of 10 so that we round these corners. And now important, add overflow hidden here, because this will ensure that any child in there, which is our image of course, can't overlap what we set up here. So now with this setup, we add our rounded corners here back to the top. And now these are the image items I want here. And of course, that's also a scrollable list where you also see that these images are lazy loaded automatically, which we can continue working with. Of course, the next goal could be that we can also view the details screen.